Everybody sees my desktop,
Yes.
which, by the way, is a Linux Mint desktop, to which I've added a few things. These are the only two things I've added. Just the time and settings desklet. A desklet is just a little widget that leads to something else. So what I want to do first is backtrack a little bit to something that John Rudy brought up with me in an email. He received a notification that looked like a blue dot on the usual Windows updates are ready notification. Usually it'll be a yellow dot. In Windows 10, we've seen this when there was a feature update. But in this particular instance, if he clicked on it, he would see, let me go here. He would see this. He would see his Windows updates, and he would see a banner that says your Windows 11 upgrade is ready. And he was wondering, well, what should I do about this? Do I really want to do this? And we all have, with the help of Drew King, we have decided that probably that's a little premature, so let's not do that. So you just click on stay on Windows 10 for now, and you won't see this banner anymore, and you won't be bothered. There are no forced upgrades as far as I know at this time. I want to go back to that the same thing had happened in Windows 10 with feature updates. Personally, I've never seen this, but then again, I've got it blocked through something you have available in Windows 10 Pro called group policies, which I won't explain. But there are some references, and I'm going to put a PDF of this into the chat. So I have references about how you can enable or disable this particular icon. And another thing that could happen if you're not lucky or if you're not paying attention, you might actually click something that starts the install process. And you'll end up on this screen, which says install Windows 11. It's okay. All you need to do is just hit the decline button and you're out of there. No problem. And then you can do whatever you want to either block or ignore it in the future. So those are the main ways you may encounter a notification that your device is ready for a Windows 11 upgrade. If you want to block the notifications, there are ways to do this, but I won't take up group time with it. And here are some more things that you can do to block various side notifications or to make sure that you always will stay on a particular feature update version. For everything you can do in group policy with regard to these things, you can make a registry key. Online, if you go to a reputable website, AskVG is a reputable site, you might be able to find a .reg file that will allow you to make the change automatically. And there should be a second .reg file that will allow you to reverse the change if you ever want to in the future. But one thing you should do if you make the registry key, look at what that registry key value is so that you know how you want to parse the feature update version that you want to stay on, because that will change over time. You'll want different feature updates.
Bob, just a quick question. My understanding is that if you do install Windows 10, they allow you a window to actually go back and revert back, 11 rather, revert to Windows 10. So that yes, even if you go all the way through it, you start using it and say, I don't like this, you can revert back. No harm done.
Yes, Peter, that is absolutely true. You have a 10-day window. And do not run disk cleanup during that 10-day window, or you may lose the files you need to get back. There is a way of tricking things out. Again, it's a registry edit, so that you have up to 60 days to keep trying Windows 11 in trial mode. And then after that time, I don't think you can extend it further. I believe it's a free article in Ask Woody, formerly known as Windows Secrets, this week that tells you the details. And I think somebody sent an email about that to the group, specifically mentioning that article.
Oh, this may have been mentioned last time, but the Windows Update 21H2 which came out last month. Is that an advisable one to go to at this point?
For Windows 10, 21H2 is the advisable one. There's very little change between the 2004 and the 21H2. I mean the 21H1, I should say. 2004 is the one that's going away. 21H1 and 21H2 have very little difference between them. So it's perfectly acceptable, in fact, recommended to be on 21H2. 21H2. The problem is 21H2 is also the code for the upgrade to Windows 11. That's 21H2. So you got to be very careful which 21H2 you're on. You can specify Windows 10 at 21H2 if you are up to date on your Windows cumulative updates, rather than specifying 21H2, which could land you on Windows 11. Although again, you'll be warned, and the vast majority of your computers aren't even eligible. So don't worry, you won't get off. Okay, having done that, I have a little fun stuff from Make Use Of, and any illustrations herein are from the article from Make Use Of. So I am crediting where credit is due. 16 creative projects to reuse your old PC. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so there are several DIY, do-it-yourself projects to repurpose and reuse an old PC, a laptop, your screens, your hard drive, and other accessories that might be in your computer. So they've thrown in some ways to trade in old hardware or turn it into cash. I'm not going to cover how to turn it into cash, but we can have a little discussion at the end of this about where in Lexington they are accepting used PCs.
Bob,
And
does
which
this also apply to Apple products? If you have an old Apple machine, does it work the same way?
Much of this does. However, some of these things you'll have a harder time doing with Apple because the software is not as available. And I don't think you can replace the Apple operating system with Linux on Mac. Or it's not easy. If you can't replace the operating system with Linux, about half of these things you won't want to do. So I edited the list to eliminate some of the more far out there ideas, but you can read the article and find out some really weird things you can do with an old PC, including some artwork and some furniture. But one of the practical things you could do is make a media center. And this illustration is from the article. So one of the most useful things you can do with an old PC is to move it into your living room and repurpose it as a media center. A media center differs from a server in that it is a specialized computer that is used to watch movies and TV. You listen to music, you play games, and you can install and set up Kodi, which is better set up under Linux than Windows, or you can use any of a number of older Windows operating systems, and I'll have a few notes on those. A nice benefit is that Media Center software is lightweight and doesn't require a lot of system resources. So you can use it even on very old hardware. And in fact, the last Media Center Windows did was Windows 7, and that works on quite old hardware. I know some people who have run Windows Media Center PCs using Windows 7, and they have them still up and running. And some who have Windows Home Server still up and running. Windows Home Server is no longer officially supported by Microsoft, but there is an open source fork which has been created. It is still maintained, though I am not sure I would trust the security patch status of that project. When Windows 7 went out of support, such projects became increasingly risky if they connect to the internet. And what's the point of a media center if you can't download media? And I put it on there without any fear that you're going to get it infected or something, or you're going to infect your whole home network if you're connected. So these days, it's probably better to go with Linux and with Kodi for your media PC setup. Linux is more lightweight than Windows, and Kodi is very lightweight. Or if you want to build your bucks with the Plex server, that software package is a little more built, a little more refined. It has more options right out of the install than Kodi. It's less do-it-yourself, and it's used by the Silicon Dust Home Run HD dedicated media boxes. Plex is paid software.
Bob,
Yeah.
is Kodi a substitute for Linux, or is it software?
Kodi
Sure.
is software that sits on top of Linux.
Okay,
Kodi is a media server package which sits on top of the Linux operating system and provides the specialized software you will need for your media center.
okay,
Clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, George,
Okay.
just think of it as an application.
It's
Okay.
more than an application, actually. It's more of a shell environment.
Oh, you're absolutely right. But if you think of it that way, it simplifies the process.
Yeah, but it's like a multi-application environment, multi-application. So Plex has a lot more built-in channels than Kodi, and it has a really nice program guide, which for Kodi you have to download and you may even have to pay for. And the Plex program guide is what you're paying for more than anything else there. Windows Media Center still has a program guide that is kept up as an open source project, but I wouldn't count on it always being up to date. Here's a disclaimer. Anytime I mention Kodi, I have to use this disclaimer. Kodi does not provide any media content or sources. Users must provide their own content and manually configure the channels for Kodi to access third-party online services. The Kodi project does not provide any support for bootleg content or other illegally sourced material, nor do they allow their community support within their official websites and services to support such content.
Bob, you can also run Kodi on a smartphone. Right?
Yeah,
I've
you
been
can run it on a
it's right
phone.
in the Play library.
It is lightweight enough. Yes, you can run it on some high-end phones quite nicely. And then you can have your music library with you. However, there are other apps for smartphones that are a little more appropriate to the form factor and various other things about a phone. I won't get into that today, but there are other ways of doing media on a phone that probably would be nicer. But Kodi does exist for the phone. However, Linux basically doesn't exist for smartphones, unless you want to count Android. Another thing you can do with an old PC is you can build a home server. You can use your old PC to host your media files and other files and access them whenever you need. This is handy if you only have a limited amount of hard drive space on your new PC, or if you have a lot of PCs at home and you just want to back them up to one central location. You can give access to the home servers to other users on your network, allowing you to share your files with them. Now, Drew King pointed out something about Windows 10 and 11 and home servers. If you use Windows 10 or Windows 11 or the server versions of them, Windows sharing is a nightmare if you have Apple or Linux machines on the same network. It is far easier to set up Linux and to set up a Samba share and then set up Samba sharing on your Windows devices. Apple has another way of, Apple also can use Samba on Mac. Samba can be installed on just about any platform you might have. So Samba share is much better than Windows share if you're thinking of setting it up. Therefore, I would recommend learning enough Linux so you can set up a Linux server if you want to do a home server. However, if you want to do a Windows home server, just put Samba share onto it. So Media Center and home server are closely related types of projects. But whereas the old Media Center from Windows 7 is defunct, you can still use either a Windows server or a Linux server edition to create and set up your home server. A server is great for file storage and backup for a whole house full of PCs. The server itself does not care whether it's Windows or Linux, whether it's the NTFS file system or the Linux Ext file system or ButterFS, which is a much more redundant file system and much more robust, or whatever you have. With RAID configuration, you would have built-in redundancy so that the server generally would not need further discrete backup of its own. Windows has something called pooled storage, which also provides redundancy. Pooled storage is in Windows 10 and 11. At least I think it's in 11 home, but you might have to move up to Pro. So you could also set up a web server And I'm not sure what's up with this illustration. Here. There is an article which is linked to the main article here that will show how the steps you go through to build a web server with an old computer. It's a little technical and I don't really want to get into it today. So what if you want to host files on the internet? If you have your own website, you can host your site yourself from home instead of having to pay for a hosting service or using free hosts which inject ads which kind of look bad on your site. Again, you can use Windows or you could use Linux for a web host server. And you would have to learn a bit about how to set up servers and how they work on the internet. Another thing you can do is you can use your PC for a test rig. If you build PCs often, or if you frequently benchmark components, then a test rig is extremely useful to have on hand. You can use the extra PC to test software, OS upgrades like Windows 11, or hardware. If it's an older PC, you'd probably be testing versions of Windows 10, and you might be testing software you're not sure how good it is or how safe it is, or how stable it is. Or you might have a peripheral you want to test and you don't want to endanger your production PC or disrupt your ongoing work and your Zoom meetings. Testing Linux, testing older Windows environments, trying out new software, and testing for fatal bugs, which would crash your computer. Trying out new hardware configurations, peripherals. Many things you would not want to do on your everyday workhorse PC. And I'm not sure what's up with this illustration, but this is for a home security system you can set up yourself. If you have a simple webcam, you can connect it to your old PC to make your own home security system. Using software that detects motion and triggers, somebody mute yourself, please. If using software that detects motion and triggers an alert, you can get a notification or set off an alarm if there is unexpected movement in your home. Make Use Of, which is where this article comes from, has a tutorial on how to turn your computer into a video surveillance system. This tutorial will step you through setup and the specialized software you will need for a home security system. In other words, there's a linked article, which I can't cover because of time constraints. The best part of a do-it-yourself security is you don't depend on a web service or a paid contract to keep your home secure. One downside is you will not have dedicated 24/7 external monitoring. And if you're using it for detecting fires, you might want that monitoring. So you could also do things like create an external hard drive. This is about reusing parts. The hard drive is the most likely one you can reuse, or an SSD. Just get an enclosure, throw it in, and you can reuse it. With SSD external enclosures, there may be some considerations of which enclosure you want to use, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today. You can sometimes reuse memory, although old memory has two problems. One, memory wears out over time. And two, older memory is apt to be slow, and it may not even be compatible with a modern PC. You can also reuse some peripheral cards. You don't have to reuse the entire computer. Many of the parts make for great do-it-yourself projects all by themselves. So if parts of your PC are broken beyond repair, salvage what you can and put it to good use. I often do that with hard drives, and on my old NUC PC, I'm probably going to pull the SSD and put it in an enclosure and either reuse it or keep it as an archival SSD from what I had before. And finally, make someone happy. Donate. Here's where I want a little input from you guys. Does anybody know in Lexington where you can donate old PCs and what they do with them?
I can answer to that. There's a colleague of mine who runs a charity where he takes old PCs, refurbishes them, wipes them off, refurbishes them, and sends them to, sells them or gives them to people who would not otherwise be able to get a machine.
Do you happen to know if they change the operating system to Linux or if they just use Windows?
He's just using Windows.
Okay,
There's also a reused PC going to basically children of refugees and asylum seekers. And I was involved in basically refurbishing a whole bunch of donated PCs that went to that organization. And I'll look up the contact person and send it out in an email to the group later.
yeah. And Steve, if you dig up the reference for the place you're talking about, you could also send that out, please. Anyone else got ideas where people reuse them?
Just for the record, Bob, my understanding is one of the issues with old PCs is a lot of times that the people who need them, sometimes they're incompatible with the software, especially young kids in school. It's incompatible with the software that they're using in school these days. So it
Yeah.
becomes a little bit of a hassle to set, give them to, then set them up. If somebody just wants to use them for email and web surfing and what have you, it's much easier. And
That's what we ended up doing with all of the donated laptops is if they did not have Windows 10 on them, or if they had inadequate memory, we would upgrade the memory and install Windows 10 on the machine so that the likelihood of being compatible and having enough memory to actually do useful work was highly probable.
yeah, and you did a great job with LexWrap, Bob. You really did.
Yep.
Also, although I don't know where the place is, there are some places which, at least at some times during the pandemic, were collecting Chromebooks for children,
Mhm.
and they were distributing them. And you could donate a Chromebook. You would normally just buy a new Chromebook and donate it. They're fairly inexpensive. So one thing that some places have also done with donated PCs, if they don't have to be used for school or work or anything, is to convert them to Linux, because that will work on many older PCs.
Mhm.
So why Linux? Because it fits with older PCs better than Windows due to hardware. And a Linux, most distros have, distro is a distribution of Linux or a flavor. Most distros of Linux fit with old PCs better than Windows because they also support older drivers. There's a lot of legacy in most Linux. Ubuntu goes way, way back. And there are some Linuxes that go even farther back. The original Linuxes were called GNU Linux, and they derived from the old Unix, which is way, way back. And many of the older drivers have been retained by some of the Linux kernels. And you can use an older kernel in Linux than the one that comes with it, or you can use a newer kernel. Kernels are not difficult to substitute in Linux, whereas in Windows or Apple, you couldn't do it. And there aren't any licensing issues, so you don't have money issues and you don't have, can I use this license here? You can convert your own old PCs to Linux fairly easily. And I think we're going to start exploring how we can do this. But first, here's something John Rudy, although he's not here, asked me, and he pesters me about this. What if I need Linux help? He's asking me, if I have a problem with my Linux computer, where's the geek squad I can call up on the phone? They come over to my house and they just fix the computer and get me back up and running. Or I can bring my computer to them and they'll fix it. Well, I'll first say there are good ways of getting support through the Linux forums before I answer the direct question. Linux forums, there is a make use of article about how to get a response. You're more likely to get a response. You're more likely to get a respectful response instead of something that says, well, you really should have read our FAQs and whatnot. And just how to make sure that your question gets the answer you need. The best place to get help for Linux is online, but it's important to approach that help in a certain way. The article gives tips on that. In the Boston area, we're very fortunate to have several groups that use Linux and that meet from time to time. Natick Foss is one of these groups, and they also have several members who are on the Mastodon social media network, which is an open source alternative to Facebook. And they are at several places on Mastodon. Mastodon is not centrally hosted. It is hosted by a federation of different servers that are independent of one another, but they all have far stricter standards of conduct than Facebook. You aren't going to get away with misbehaving the way people do on Facebook. But you can certainly ask some Linux users if you can get some Linux help. There are members of the Boston Linux and Unix Users Group, BLU, which was meeting at MIT. Now both Natick Foss and BLU meet on a Zoom-like application called Jitsi. Jitsi, you only have to get into your browser. You can use it on Windows. You can use it on Linux. I don't know if it works well on Mac, but you can join their meetings, or they stream live on YouTube. Natick Foss is probably more accessible to new users because Dick Miller and company out there keep basically down to the end user level. They're not dealing with enterprise environments or complex networks or things like that. And then there are also more specialized groups like the Boston Network User Group, BNUG, which Steve Ivansenberg knows how to contact. And APCUG is an umbrella organization consisting of many user groups across the United States. They have sponsored Linux help groups and Linux learner groups from time to time. And they have videos which are very detailed and will really take you through a textbook style course in how to get going with Linux and what you can do with it. And most of the questions you'll ever want answered are somewhere in those videos. And then there are some various resources. I'll be posting PDFs of these slideshows to the chat, so my references will come through. And for APCUG. So yes, there is Linux help available. You may even know some people who could help you if you ask. But please don't ask me to come over to your house and fix your Linux computer. So now the question is, well, now that we might be interested, how would we get started with Linux? At this point, are there any questions or comments?
I was just saying, I've been running Linux Mint for about 5 years now. I'm quite happy with it, but the one thing is, if you get into trouble, sometimes it's easy to fix, sometimes it's a bitch to fix. And you have to be a little, yeah, most of the help assumes you're a bit of a geek.
Yes, a lot of it, but there are places you can get very basic instructions on very basic things in Linux. You just have to know how to dig around and find it.
Right.
Ask Ubuntu has both advanced and beginner topics, for example.
You search through, if it's a difficult problem, you search through an awful lot. You may not find a satisfactory solution. So I'm just saying it maybe it's not for the faint of heart.
You took the words out of my mouth, Larry. I think that's the same thing. It really requires a little bit of technical know-how. Somebody who just said, geez, that's an interesting thing to do, is going to have a little trouble.
There are ways of making it a little easier. And Linux Mint is one of the easiest Linuxes to get into. For one thing, if you look at this desktop, it looks pretty familiar to Windows and Apple users. It's got the taskbar where it ought to be. It's got the notifications where they ought to be. It's got your frequently used applications and activities where they ought to be. This is your main menu for every application. So it's a start menu. You've got all kinds of things that are really familiar to you. Now, if you get into a technical issue, or if you get stuck, or if you change something or something gets changed and it messes things up, you're going to want to be able to go back to a snapshot of how it was before it got messed up. That's something most Linux newcomers don't do. they don't learn how to use a very useful tool called time shift. And I will be briefly glossing through the fact that you can set up time shift as you set up your Linux. And that will give you, just like Apple Time Machine, it'll give you a chance to get back to where you were before it got messed up.
So,
That takes
Bob,
a lot. Yeah,
we've moved on, but I wanted to ask you a question about
sure.
the Linux that underlies the Mac OS. I mean, is that some special Linux? Why can't I just go into the terminal and go down and behave like I'm using a Linux machine?
Okay, that's actually a very good question. Just a minute, with Linux, okay, with Apple, let's start with Apple. Their operating system was derived from Unix fairly directly. They did not go through the GNU Linux period of time. And so their kernel really has not a lot in common with the GNU Linux kernel. They were a very early branch. And Apple has things tied to, they used to have things tied to ROMs on the motherboard. And because they did have that, they were taking shortcuts that you just don't have available in GNU Linux. So the answer is no, Apple does not directly run it, but Apple has Boot Camp. It has something like that anyway. I don't know if it's Parallels or it's Boot Camp, but you can run a virtual machine. And Linux in a virtual machine works quite well on Apple hardware. Even on the new M1 hardware, you can run Linux, but they're still working on it because that is a reduced instruction set. It's ARM. So Chromebooks, some of them are set up with something called Crostini. Those are high-end Chromebooks. And Crostini is an environment in which you're running something that is very close to native Linux. And you can install Ubuntu and several other Linux distros into Crostini. Windows has the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL. Now the Windows subsystem for Linux, while it's not a virtual machine and not exactly an emulator, again, it isn't quite the same as running a full Linux, but in Windows 11, WSL will run Linux apps. You can run full distros. You can run graphical applications. They're also, as Drew King told us, working on being able to run Android apps natively on the Windows 11, on the hardware in Windows 11. So the answer is for Apple, yeah, it's kind of a derivative of Unix rather than Linux. Android is often said to be Linux, but you can't put Linux onto an Android phone. You can't substitute. They tried getting it so you could have a substitute ROM for Ubuntu, but it never really took off, Ubuntu phone. So, yeah.
So Bob, a quick few comments to rewind things a little bit. So
okay.
Linux has been around for 30 years, like circa 1991. It started out as command line, much like DOS.
Right.
And people, if you're facile with command line and like to use command line, it never went away. It's still there. Yeah. So the way they made it more user-friendly was to do what Windows did, essentially put different graphical interfaces on it to make it Windows-like, and that's what's out there today. And that's why you have the different paths and the different free versions and so on. And then there are Red Hat, for example, is a paid version that's used commercially, and there are free versions of that. And Red Hat has more support, for example.
Yeah.
The underlying command line is present in all. The utilities get ported over. There's actually, and it was written in C at the beginning, and a lot of the utilities actually can be run on Windows directly. There's Unix utils, for example, that you can run under Windows or under DOS, and you can get a flavor of what they did on the command line. That was part of the quirkiness of Unix at the beginning. Was the command line was all you had to know the little abbreviations, and then they invented things way back when, like pipes and one program into another to build up things that are pretty common these days, even under
Yeah.
DOS. And if you want to bring in some of the DOS utility, you can. I'm sorry, the Unix utility into
Yeah.
DOS, it's pretty straightforward to do that. And just bring
Yeah,
in one by one.
The Windows subsystem for Linux will actually allow you to do something much closer to what I've got here, an actual Linux desktop and Linux applications, including the graphical ones and including the terminal. So you can do command line. Command line is something that's useful to know, but I just want to assure everybody you don't need to know it to get started. You can get started without it. And that's going to be my whole point of how easy it is to get started. I wanted to let you know about something that is command line, but also has a graphical. This is a graphical interface for ClamAV. So yes, you have both the graphical and the command line version. And the graphical is a lot easier for me to follow. But when you update it, you may be going into the command line to do the update of the definitions. And there are some security programs which hunt for rootkits in Linux, which are still command line.
Bob, what was that again?
ClamAV, it's the one antivirus program that Linux users often do run.
How do you spell that?
CLAM AV.
Oh,
And it has a graphical interface called ClamTK. The TK in ClamTK is for the GTK graphical environment.
A
Okay.
lot of the utilities were started out as command line, and then they added shells of different types to make it more user-friendly, as Bob was saying. ClamAV, there's restrictions on sizes of files you can scan, and there's other issues with it, but it's used in enterprise software, actually. On some of the servers, they install that to scan your uploads and downloads of attachments, for example.
And you can sort of lift, at least on a personal computer, you can lift the size restriction, and it can become a very large size that you can scan. So you can scan entire disk images or ISOs and things like that. Email attachments are the main thing that people do scan with ClamAV, because that's the main way that malicious programs get into Linux. You see, Linux doesn't run as administrator, and the programs don't run as administrator. In Windows, some of the programs do, and some modules of the programs run as administrator. You don't have a trusted installer in Linux. You're running as limited user, and you will have to put in a password for a lot of things you want to do when you're doing maintenance and updating. And we will see that. What I want to do now, if I can manage this, and this is not a terribly clear video, but it's a video that gives sort of a feeling for how it is to install Linux Mint. And by the way, as our time is running, I think we are going to run short enough, so we'll have some discussion time at the end. Can everybody at least see the video screen?
You're good, Bob. You may want to maximize it before you actually show the video.
Then I'm going to lose you guys, I think, but let me see what happens. Oh, good. I don't lose you guys, but I have to minimize you guys. Okay. And I'll go full screen.
Oh, not yet.
Okay. Now I lost
There
you
we go.
guys. Let me see if I can still. Oh, yeah, I can see you guys if I have to. Okay. So I'm going to try to minimize you. There you go. And this first screen is a tool called Ventoy. And I think I need to go back into a slideshow to show you what Ventoy is, because this is how you will create your boot media, your install media for Linux. And this tool will allow you to create a multi-boot flash drive. So you can have all of your installers and even several utilities all in one place. Sometimes that's a good thing to be able to do. So what I want to do is go to here, and this is the Cinnamon desktop as it's illustrated in the article that I referenced. I will post this slideshow as well as a PDF. There are 4 basic utilities I want, and this is why I'm using Ventoy. Ventoy creates a bootable USB flash drive with several utilities all in one place. Gparted Live in case you need to change partitions on your target drive. If you're doing a single boot and taking over the whole hard drive of the computer, you probably won't run into these issues. And you will want the install disk image or ISO for your chosen Linux distro, Mint in this case. And you may need a grub boot repair ISO. Just as in Windows, you sometimes end up needing to repair the boot environment. You may need to do that for Linux. The good thing about the grub boot repair utility is that it's automatic, and with one click, it fixes most common Linux booting issues. It's usually not needed for a whole disk single boot install as we're showing today. We can put all these tools onto one USB flash drive, as big as you want, but I would recommend at least 16 gigabytes if you're going to have 4 or more utilities, just because of the size of the ISOs. And you use a multi-boot USB drive creation tool called Ventoy. And there's an article about that in Linux Uprising. Linux Uprising is a really good source for some of the more technical stuff about Linux. Answer the phone. You install this tool, Ventoy, to a USB drive, then simply copy some ISO files directly onto the USB drive, just raw ISOs. And you can then boot from any of these ISOs with no other changes. Once Ventoy becomes aware that the ISO is present by scanning for it, Ventoy can boot any of your ISOs. You still have to restart in between, but you don't have to swap out different flash drives and wear out your ports and everything like that.
Bob,
So,
just a quick question. The Ventoy, will that work on a Windows machine as well? Can you create a USB multi-boot USB for Windows as well?
Actually, I will show you in this documentation that that is very definitely a possibility. And you can mix and mingle. You can have ISOs that are for Linux. You can have ISOs that are for WinPE. You can have ISOs that are for Windows install. So instead of doing what the Windows media creation tool does, using up the whole flash drive, you can use just what the Windows installer needs. And Ventoy will boot you right into the Windows installer. You can use Windows installers for repairing Windows also sometimes. Depends on what you need to do. Yeah. Okay. So yes, you can do that. An ISO is simply a disk image. In this case, the entire environment needed to launch and run the utility is contained in the ISO. So you think of an ISO as a portable app. To use several of them from one boot menu, you need a framework which will integrate all the ISOs and allow us to choose from one boot menu. And this is just simply how the graphical interface on Windows or on Linux will set up your flash drive for your first setup with Ventoy. And the article goes into some detail. So you choose the USB drive from a device list. Optionally, you can enable secure boot. In a Windows machine, if you have secure boot on, there will be some Linux-based ISOs which will not boot until you turn off secure boot. And that's not a good thing to have to do constantly, going in and out of your BIOS or your EFI, because that's just really rough on your BIOS chip. So you can install, you click the install button to install Ventoy to the USB stick. That's the only actual install that you need to do. Now that Ventoy is installed, you can create a bootable USB drive simply by copying some ISO files onto the USB drive, or you can create a folder on the USB drive and put them in there. And it doesn't matter whether they're Linux or whether they're Windows or whether they're whatever else can fit onto an ISO. As long as it's bootable and as long as Ventoy knows how to boot it. I am not able to demo the updating of Ventoy because that would require going out of my Zoom session. And the article goes into a lot more detail. Adding, taking out, modifying, and updating are simply a matter of downloading the ISOs, placing them into an ISO folder, I have an ISO folder in my documents directory so that I can keep a bunch of up-to-date ISOs for tools that I will use on Ventoy. Then just copy over to Ventoy and update Ventoy using its own tools so that the boot menu knows what you've got. During boot, Ventoy searches all the directories and subdirectories recursively to find all ISO files that it recognizes inside the USB drive. So when you change something, you just remove the old ISO and put the new ISO in. And Ventoy should be able to just pick it up. And so you can change one ISO without changing everything. I will not talk about it, but Ventoy does also allow persistence so that you could actually use that flash drive to run Linux or maybe even Windows. So then there's a place to download the Mint ISO, and you then boot into a live Mint session. And that's where I'm going to start the video. The video has us selecting from the Ventoy menu to the Linux live environment. And the way Steve did this video, this was Steve Eisenberg who did this, and I thank him very much for doing that. The video, at times this is not going to be terribly clear because the way it was shot with a camera looking at a monitor screen, sometimes the print doesn't show up very well, but I'll try to talk you through those times. And we're just going to boot into the Linux installer. And from there, he's going to select the install option. So here we go, start Linux Mint. And it's starting up. This is actually the ISO starting up. So it starts in RAM and it may be slow on some computers. And this is the environment you're in. This is all in RAM on your computer. It's in memory. And on an older computer, it may be really, really slow. And we're going to select install. And we are now, this is where it's a little blurry. We are now selecting our language. There, that's a little better. We're selecting our language, English. And then we keep going for a little while. And okay, we're selecting our keyboard. You can select from a large variety of keyboards. There's Dvorak, there's various positions of the Alt and Control and function keys and all kinds of other things. Normally you just stay with the default unless you've got a really weird old computer that's got a weird keyboard. Or if you've got a Chromebook. I don't think they have one for Chromebook. But Chromebooks can be converted to Linux. I won't say anything more about that. Multimedia Codecs, normally I would not download these during the install process. It takes bandwidth, it takes time, and it's not necessary for a reason that you will see later. When you install VLC Player, it brings down with it a lot of media codecs, probably all the codecs it needs. But Steve checked this off because I didn't tell him not to, so that's okay. We're just going to do this. And after a little while, we should be getting to the next stage. There's a little time delay here. Let me see, that's about, where am I? Okay. Now, the multimedia codecs being installed. Okay. What the installer is telling Steve at this point is that he has some mounted partitions. There are partitions that are in use. I don't know, maybe he was booting into something before this, but not everything is totally quiescent. And the Linux installer doesn't like this, and it wants to unmount those partitions so that you have a totally inactive drive. If you're going to format the entire drive, excuse me, you have to have all the partitions unmounted. It's just like you can't restore with a restore software. You can't restore from a backup if the partition you're restoring to is still mounted. Here are your options. You can erase something that he already had installed and just install into that partition, which is a smaller partition. He can install this Linux Mint alongside of his existing installations. Give me a second, I'm going to get a drink of water. Okay, we're back. Or you can erase the entire disk and install Linux Mint. Or you can do something else. You can do a lot of customization at this point. I won't go into it. So we're going to erase the whole disk and install Mint because that's simplest. Now note the size of Steve's disk, 320 gigabytes. Normally what we who use Linux recommend is you need at most about 30 gigabytes for a normal home user install. And you might set aside another 30 gigabytes for data, user data. And you might want to keep your user data separate from your system so that you can restore more easily in the event of disaster. However, we're going to do the whole 320 gigabytes as a single partition. Another thing that sometimes is done is to separate out a small partition, which is unformatted, and label it swap. That requires using a tool like gparted to just simply designate that partition as swap. What this does is it does something like page filing in Windows, paging. You copy contents of memory to disk and back again. Very useful if you have limited RAM on your old hardware. And the size of your swap partition should be about twice the size of your RAM. Maybe larger if you think you're going to want to hibernate. Normally Linux doesn't hibernate, but you can set it up so that it will. I would say not more than 20 gigabytes is needed if you have 8 gigabytes of RAM. So you can have a 20 gigabyte swap partition, a 30 gigabyte data partition, and 30 to 60 gigabytes for Linux, for system, also known as root partition. And we'll just go ahead and do the install. 2 partitions will be overwritten. Warning, you're about to write some stuff to your disk and you're about to overwrite some stuff. We'll do that. And of course, if there are any questions, feel free to interrupt me. Okay, we're setting up our time zone. And that's going to be New York, East Coast, because they don't have one for Boston. And you're going to put in your name. That's kind of optional, but most of the time you do it. Your computer's name, which may be different from your name. Mine is different. And you'll pick a username and you'll choose a password and confirm it. And Steve's going to put in a short password, but it doesn't matter because he's going to log in automatically. And I require a password because I don't know where my computer is going to be on any given day. You can encrypt your home folder. Your home folder contains almost all of your personal data and many of your personal settings. So if you encrypt that, it's pretty much going to protect your personal data. Although it isn't the best encryption available, you can use other encryption on top of it. Or instead of it, I mean.
Bob, this password is ostensibly for root privilege, correct?
There are 2 reasons. One is overall security, so that other people aren't messing with you. And if your laptop travels, you'll need it. But it is also your root password, your root user password. This is like the administrator password in Windows, where you will need it anytime you do system level functions that require you to make changes basically to any system areas. Linux is big on permissions, and you don't have permission to do everything as the limited user. Linux runs as limited user. That's a security thing. Because if you got in as root, you could do things with rootkits that are just unbelievable. Did we have a question? Okay, we can continue now.
I just wanted to say one thing, Bob.
Yeah.
People will find that I use the Lintoy by many different installs, flavor operating system appearances. Try each one, install the one you want to draw. And then as well to
Hey,
do the
Steve,
installation using the default.
you're breaking up an awful
Don't
lot.
normally
It's hard to
do
hear
all
you.
the other-
All right, Bob, I
I'll
got most of
type.
that, but I think you may have to repeat some of it. You're talking about Ventoy, and you're talking about when you have multiple installers.
Yes. Meaning
And-
you can try different versions to see what you like. You try different versions to see what you like. And then the install will be by just select.
Yeah, good point, Bob. This Ventoy does allow you to try different distros and see which one you might like. And see how you can also see whether a particular distro will even work on your hardware. Because sometimes you'll boot into it and something about it is just not right for your hardware and it doesn't work. And so you know you're either going to need a different driver or you know you're going to run into some trouble with that distro. So you might try a different one. And you'll find some of them have a nice look and feel that you like, some of them not so much. And there are other things you'll discover as you play around with Linux. You can do Linux Live. You can do Linux Live with persistence, and that's very secure for things like banking and other confidential transactions. So yeah, there's a lot you can do with Ventoy. And thanks for pointing that up. You can try different distros. And I would recommend maybe play around with a couple or three and see which one appeals to you. Personally, I use Ubuntu every day, but that's because I have more advanced needs than Mint usually will accommodate. I mean, you can do the same things in Mint, but it's not as easy. The tools aren't all there. But Mint is very good for getting started. Okay, so continuing with what we're doing here, this video runs about 12 minutes. So we're doing the password. And then you're going to see the login change to automatic. So we'll continue. Now, this is the point at which I might fast forward a little bit because it's going to create a file system. Notice that the file system it created was ext4, which is one of the more common Linux file systems. And we're copying files and downloading and installing stuff. Let me see what point I want to be at.
Hey, Bob, does this install have bloatware? It looks like it has bloatware as well as some other stuff.
I don't call it bloatware. There are some very basic programs that come along with Mint. You don't have, well, with Mint, you get them. With Ubuntu, if you do the install, you don't have to accept the OEM stuff, if you will. You don't have to accept it. But with Mint, with the installer, it does by default install all of it. You can get rid of it later if you don't want it, but
Yeah, of course. Right.
with Linux, it's also lightweight. You might just as well keep it around. It's not going to cause you any problems. And if it does cause problems, get rid of whatever causes you a problem. There are package managers, including the one that's built into Mint. And there's a package manager called Synaptic, where you can just uncheck checkboxes if you want to get rid of something or check new checkboxes to put something new in. Okay, so this will keep copying files for a while and it will advertise the various features. And yeah, Peter, if you want to call it bloatware, it's bloatware, but it's really basic software. I mean, who doesn't want an Office application when you start? You might also want a photo editor, which is the GIMP, but you might not need all the media stuff that they put in.
But it doesn't cost anything. They're not going to ask you to.
Understood.
Right. They're not going to ask you to pay for anything. No subscriptions, no Office 365, no cloud stuff. Well, there is cloud stuff, but there is nothing that needs to connect to the cloud except software updating. at least to begin with. And here's where some additional software is being downloaded. With Ubuntu in the installer, you don't have to take the updates. This is what's happening now. It's updating all kinds of stuff. And you can do that after the install. But of course, that will lengthen your first trip through the software updater. So you save one place, you pay another place. And Thunderbird's a very nice email client. It's in Linux. And various other things go on. We're up to what, the 4-minute mark? And so configuring hardware means there are drivers being installed. And when we get to about the 5:02 mark, we will be at the, and here's more additional packages. Who knows what all that is? Okay. So it's doing a little more installing, downloading more packages. By the way, it said running dpkg. dpkg is depackage. That's one of the 2 ways you install. You install or you depackage in Linux. And now it says the installation is complete. And in order to, you could continue with the live and continue experimenting and seeing whether or not this is what you really wanted. But now that you've got it installed, you might just as well restart and get into your first encounter with the Linux Mint environment.
Hey, Bob, for what it's worth, I think if you go to the little gear icon, you can speed up the playback so that it goes a little faster since there's no audio.
I'm aware of that, Peter, but it isn't really that long a video, so I don't think we'll have any problem fitting it in.
Just information.
Thank you very much for that. Here's something I want to point out. You'll see very often in Linux when it boots some screen garbage. That screen garbage usually will not mean anything that you have to watch out for, but if you see anything in red, it may mean something failed, and it may give some details, and you might want to try to see if you can get a quick peek at what failed. There are other ways of getting the startup log, the boot log, and looking at it to see what went wrong. So that's basically what it's doing. It's telling you what it's going through, the steps it's going through as it boots, and there's more steps. Sometimes it's interesting just to see all the things that go on during a boot. You can also cause this not to show up by changing a setting so that you won't see it. Okay, and here we are on the Mint desktop, either there or almost there. Yeah, initially it doesn't have much on it, just a home directory and maybe a trash icon, very little stuff. This welcome stuff shows up only when you're doing your first setup. And then eventually you just simply uncheck the checkbox that says show this dialog at startup, and you won't see the welcome every time. But this time we do want to see it because we're going to do some things. This is post-install. And here's where you get to see what the installer has put in. You have just general layout and appearance. And this is time shift, system snapshots. We'll see very briefly setting it up. We won't go into detail about it. And so most of this stuff you won't change, but here's setting up the system snapshots. So if from this point onward, anything goes wrong, we'll be able to get back here and we'll have something we know does boot. So that's one of the important things in troubleshooting. You set up your first snapshot. Now, a snapshot should ideally be saved on an external drive. And there are locations to back up from, things you want to back up, including your home directory. And you'll perhaps want to set a schedule of how often this will happen. So it'll happen on a regular basis if your computer is on. And then it shows you what you're backing up, home and root. Root is the system directory. And then when you've got that all set up, you have that, then time shift is active. and it should be using an external drive at this point. This is a little different from Windows file history. It's more like the Apple Time Machine. Now, the next thing Steve's going to look at here is Driver Manager. 9 times out of 10, you won't find anything interesting in here, but it's something you should check. He checks, nothing interesting, nothing to see. I didn't have anything interesting in there either, but I still had a driver issue. I can discuss that a little bit later if we have a little time at the end. And seeing nothing, we go on to the Update Manager. This is your first system update. You may have a lot of stuff to update. Now, here's something that Steve did not do because I didn't tell him to do it. He has a blue bar at the top that says, we suggest you switch to a local mirror. That will get you faster connections, faster downloads, and you're less likely to get your connection interrupted. If you use their default server, you may be using a server that's in London, England. And that's why you want to go to a local mirror. There's one right here in the Boston area, I think. But in any event, we didn't do that, so that's okay. We're going to need to update the updater. That's the first thing you do. And all this is going to require root password. And then it's doing this and that and the other, and it will refresh the offerings, and this is what's available to update. Now, there's something else that will show up as soon as you start to install the updates. This is something that happens less frequently. These are kernel updates. In Linux, if there's a kernel update available, you can say no by canceling, or you can say okay. But if you get a kernel update, the default in Mint is that it'll update the kernel. When you reboot, it will boot from the first menu entry in the bootloader, and that's going to be the new kernel. That can have some interesting consequences. Stuff can break, and you may need to go back to a previous kernel. Also, Linux cleans up old kernels so that the older kernels that you have may go away when you install a new kernel. Those are things to be aware of. Usually I just take the kernel, and if nothing goes wrong, I'm fine. If I have to reinstall an older kernel, I have a way of doing that rather painlessly using the Synaptic package manager, which is different from this package manager. I won't go into details about that, but you can roll back kernel update disasters or just boot from a different kernel. And so we are going to install the software. And if I let this run, we only have about 3 or 4 minutes left in the video.
The whole process took about an hour. I sped up some of the video and cut out some parts.
Yes, this is sped up and it is edited. Yeah, the whole install and setup end to end should take about an hour or less. Although I have seen it take longer. Now, anytime you have a kernel update, you must restart. Anytime you do software updating, you may have to restart, but it's often a good idea to restart. If you just update a few things, you don't have to restart in Linux. And we're getting back in, having done all of this. And I think there's just a couple of more things post-install that we're going to attend to. Okay, you get your welcome again, and we're doing our setup, and we are down to, we'll take a look at the system settings. Well, first we go to the update manager, make sure there's nothing new. Seeing nothing, now we go on to looking at the system settings. We can just take a look at the system settings. Okay, there's a software manager. We'll do software manager first. Here we'll see some things you might want to add. There are categories. And there are picks, editor picks. Wine is for running Windows programs. The GIMP I thought was installed with Linux Mint, but apparently here we have another version, an updated version that can be installed. Gparted is a disk utility, and usually you'll use a utility called disks. And there are some differences, which I won't go into.
It's
So we're
important
going to
note
select.
that all of these are free.
Yeah, they're all free. There is software you can get for Linux that is paid, but these are free. And we're going to do LibreOffice. LibreOffice is included with Mint, but here there's another version being offered, and you may want the latest version. So you're upgrading. And this is all the stuff that comes with it. One good thing about using a software manager, it will usually tell you and maybe offer to install any of these dependencies. Otherwise, you may have a nightmare of having to search all over the place for where's this dependency, where's that one, and what do I install first, second, third, 81st. You don't want to have to do that. Synaptic Package Manager also will alert you to dependencies. And so we install. And once that's installed, there's one other thing that we're going to want to take a look at. Now, Dropbox is another nice thing to have, but we're going to go to Sound and Video, and we're going to go to VLC Player. Remember I said you don't really need to install the multimedia codecs during the install? This is why. VLC Player has codecs that are built in, and it has pretty much all the ones it needs. So it has all these things that it puts in, and it puts all that in. And so you should be pretty much ready to go. And there may be some other things you want. There are various media players, and there's a CD burning utility, which is that one, and all kinds of other stuff. So as soon as we get done with that, then we're going to take a brief look at system settings. Now, when you're first starting, you probably won't find that you need to change any of the system settings, but eventually you can do that. There is one thing that you can change, and that goes a little beyond the range of what this video is showing. And I will show it to you as soon as we're done here. And we're almost done. This is just things that you might want to change. It's mostly having to do with desktop and window appearance and things of that nature. Startup applications. So that's it. Now, let me see if I can just get out of that. One thing I want to show before I go for the questions and answers in the few remaining minutes, this is called a desklet. It's a desktop applet of sorts, and it leads me into settings. I had a problem after my install. This wasn't working, and there was a little pop-up box, a warning that said, this isn't working. Something's wrong with it. It turned out I needed to upgrade it, and the desklets upgrade separately from the software. And so I upgraded my desklets. I upgraded this desklet. And when I did do that, it worked okay. One other thing I saw, where this box is now, and by the way, this is just another desklet. Where this box is now, I had a pop-up notice that said something's wrong with your graphics drivers. I had been through all the drivers. I had gotten all the extra drivers I need, but there was still something wrong with my graphics drivers. Graphics acceleration was not going to work unless I got the i915 package. Well, after a lot of looking around online, I had to go to the Intel site and download and install about 9 different packages, which then put stuff into the system area. I saved those packages in a folder and copied the folder over to my user data directory, my user data partition. so that I don't have to look for those again. So this is because my hardware is really new and the graphics drivers aren't in the Linux kernel yet. Not even in the Intel specific kernel. So that's basically how it is. And it's actually pretty easy. Any questions, any comments? Was it easy? Was it not easy?
Thanks, Bob.
It's
I
like
think
all
it's
easy things. It's going to take me a week.
Yeah, of course.
Exactly.
Bobby, remind me of the old days of when I worked on Intel, and I had to use Linux for the first time. But I got a question for you.
Yeah.
What's the definition of a kernel? I completely forgot.
Okay. You have your basic IO functions, which sit below the shell.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, a kernel is basic IO. It's basic communication with your hardware. And it's low-level stuff mostly. The kernel in Linux has gotten a little bloated in some distros so that it includes stuff that should not be in the kernel, but should be up in the shell. Things like desktop appearance, window appearance, that's all a layer up from there. I have a beautiful illustration which I can email to people about the layers of an operating system. And it shows where the kernel is, where the shell is, where the application layer is, and then moving out till you get to the web browser and the internet.
Yeah, thanks.
Bob,
Because that's good. I'll tell you, when I first started with Linux, it reminded me of the early DOS days. I says, "What's the big deal?" Now
Yeah.
I'm so down old now. I forgot all those experiences. I couldn't remember. I'd be as bad as a kid trying to start off now.
For
Yeah, but-
argument's sake, Dave, the kernel is for all intents and purposes essentially the BIOS in a PC system. You can argue the differences, but to make it
Yeah.
simple, it's that. And if you
Yeah.
want to understand the layered architecture that Bob was talking about, you can think about an onion. And if you slice through an onion, you have the kernel, which is in the very middle, and you have layer on layer on layer on layer on layer
Right.
on top of that. And the very outside layer is the graphic stuff that you see in the graphical interfaces, or if you're in a command line, the command line interpreter.
And just
in that
like
environment.
with a real onion, at some point
You
you'll
cry
be
a lot.
crying. Yeah.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
Bob, can I ask you about the choice of operating systems?
Yeah.
There was a French writer named Blaise Pascal wrote in very flowery French. It doesn't equivalent. There's no equivalent in English. He wrote it in very flowery French. "I'm sorry to have written you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one."
Yeah.
How come you just don't pay Bill Gates $100 and put in Windows?
There are several reasons why you might want Linux. One, you can't run Windows 10 or 11 on your older hardware, and Windows 7 is no longer supported. So you have a security issue. Two, Windows can be kind of heavy on older hardware, and it can slow it down a lot. So you may want the additional speed and agility. And Mint is not the most lightweight Linux. There are even lighter weight Linux and lighter weight environments than the Cinnamon desktop. And so you do have options for using environments that are much quicker on old hardware. You don't wait 3, 4, 8 minutes to boot up, things like that. Some people do have a philosophical objection to paying for upgrades and subscriptions and things like that. I don't really care about that. I will pay for Windows, and I have Windows on my PC. But I find there are sometimes some things that I get done more efficiently in Linux because the software tends to be more Spartan. It tends to have fewer features and fewer options to wade through. And it just, to me, it's a better fit. To me, it feels nicer. To me, there are fewer distractions.
In my case, you have Apple and you have Google and you have Microsoft, and they all own part of you. And I figured by using Linux instead of Microsoft, I could reduce the number down to just Google.
Yeah, especially for things like an email client. My everyday workhorse is Ubuntu with clause mail. And clause mail is very Unix-like in its behavior, Unix mail. And it uses the same mailbox format and everything if you want to. Thunderbird is also good, but it's gussied up like a modern web browser or a modern email client. And I find that distracting. So yeah, there's good and there's bad in every operating system. And some people prefer Apple because it's basically hands-off. You don't have to do anything. And some people like Chromebook for that same reason. I have a Chromebook, but I also have Linux on that Chromebook, as well as Chrome OS.
I think part of the answer to what Jerry was sort of saying and I was talking about is that most people, maybe not this group, but most people generally deal with the applications that are associated with an environment. If you talk to most users, if you give them a screen with the usual applications in front of them, A, they wouldn't know, and B, they wouldn't care whether you're running Unix, Mac OS, iOS, Windows, XYZ, or Algol or something underneath it. Who the heck knows? You could pick it. It doesn't make any difference. The interface is the part that they deal with, and they can get whatever they need to get done. A lot of us are more technically proficient and more technically curious, and so getting under the covers, this becomes a much more interesting discussion.
Yeah, that's also another thing I do. I like to have really good control over how the features appear and how the apps behave. And with Linux, I can modify almost any configuration file if I really want to dig. The downside to that is I spend a lot of time on Google looking stuff up and asking myself, well, what went wrong here? And this is why you have snapshots in case things go wrong. Exactly. And you're going, oh, something went wrong. Time to roll back. And you can save your data. Save your data frequently.
You should use DuckDuckGo instead of...
Bob, you make me laugh. You know why?
Yes?
Because yesterday I was trying to change the font size of my Outlook email, which I know how to do. But then I noticed one thing, on the email on Outlook, I used to have... I could click a literal flag for a tag, and then I had a red category.
Yeah.
Well, I lost the red category. I haven't looked on Google to find out what the hell I did wrong, but it's gone.
Hey, you know what, Dave?
What?
I'm not so sure you did anything. You might just have gotten an update. And
That's what
another
I'm thinking
thing
too.
I hate. That's another thing I like about Linux. You don't have to take every update.
Yeah.
You can reject an update. You can roll back. You can use an old version, but you don't want to use too old a version because of security considerations.
I know. That's what I was thinking about. Maybe I got an update and didn't know it. Yeah.
And that's the other thing. Linux very seldom surprises me with updates that I don't see happening.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was working in the Intel field, I liked Linux. And fortunately, there were people who taught me because I didn't know a darn thing about it. I knew the DOS because I grew up with it. So it didn't bother me. I had to press a few more buttons, on the keyboard.
Well, you worry about concurrent CPM, and then you can go from there. Bob, can you talk about security and Linux and Unix flavors for a minute, and in term relative to the other operating systems?
Well, don't get me wrong. Windows 11 has very good security, and Apple has excellent security. The phone operating systems, because you can't do much with them, have really great security. Chromebook has really great security because you can't do much with it. Although I have changed some things so I can do more with it, but that puts me more at risk. Linux compared with Windows has always been said to be more secure by default because A, programs don't run with administrator privileges or super user privileges. B, the security model was built into Unix from the very beginning. They did not give you permissions and privileges, but that brings in a huge problem in Linux. If you run into a permissions issue, you're going to have a real detective job to try to fix it. And that's one of my beefs about Linux. It's not easy to fix a permissions issue, but that is better security. We skipped over the firewall, but there's actually a firewall, and you can make firewall rules that make Linux even more secure. And you can make it even more secure with even, you can do something called fire jail, which will sandbox a lot of stuff. And yes, you can do these things in Windows. It's an add-on, but it's baked into Linux. And it's not baked into Windows. Windows wants convenience. They want backward compatibility. And they do it at the expense of security, at least up until Windows 11.
Well, to your point, then I'm going to credit Bob Eckert for bringing this to the group a while ago, is that the recommended installation for Windows is to have an administrator who owns the core system of Windows, and the work that you do as a user, which is less privileged than the administrator, and therefore you don't get into as much trouble. In fact, it's difficult to get into trouble when you go bruising the web and download porn that's loaded with a whole bunch of crap in it. And all of a sudden you're in trouble. You can't do that if you're not the administrator.
Well, the flaw of that is you can, because Windows software is engineered in such a way that it has to have administrator privileges for some of what it does. And the browser is integrated into the operating system in such a way that it puts tentacles into everything.
Okay,
and it does allow access.
If in Windows 11 or Windows 10, if you use the Bing browser, which is in fact integrated into it, that's true. If you use the old IE or a third-party browser, it is not.
Yeah, Internet Explorer is pretty much gone. Third-party browsers, not so much, but they still, even Chrome under Windows or Firefox under Windows, will do more things with administrator privileges than you will find it doing the same browser under Linux.
All right, so I'm going to argue
sandbox.
with you, I think. I'm going to argue because I don't think that's true. I use Firefox, and I have set up with administrator and a user, and I'm a user on my machine.
Okay.
I use Firefox, and I never once have had the box come up saying I need administrator privileges, including the installation of Firefox.
No,
never once had it, and
it won't tell you.
It just can't. But it can't just do it. No,
Trusted installer can. Trusted installer during the install can do anything. But in Linux, if the installer wants to do something that requires root privileges, the box will pop up. It sometimes does in Windows, to be fair. So yes, you can get pretty good security with a third-party browser, and that's a good reason to use Firefox in Windows, and a good reason actually not to use Chrome, because Chrome has stuff that makes it less secure because of the extensions and the Chrome APIs.
And Google looking over your shoulder.
But you can use plain vanilla Chromium in Windows, just like you do in Linux, and then you get rid of a lot of the Google stuff.
Or as Steve likes to say, and I do it as well, use DuckDuckGo and
DuckDuckGo and the Chromium browser, plain Jane Chromium, and it works pretty well. Chromium, by the way, is open source.
Yeah, just for the record, I use Firefox with DuckDuckGo as a search.
Yeah, and you can also put on some extensions that will actually protect you under Windows and under Linux.
Yep.
But one thing Linux does not really need is, other than the firewall, active security. It doesn't need a security program looking over your shoulder. Although you can put security into your browser that'll look over your shoulder and say, you don't really want to go to that website.
Yep.
So I'm going to say thank you, Bob, and I'm going to wish everybody a happy new year.